Hello everyone, welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfic. Today will be the continuation of Deku and Death. This will be Part 7, Chapter 7, entitled, I Can't Die For You, but that doesn't mean I'll live for you. As All Might flew high across the sky, his thoughts were still heavily grounded on the green-haired boy beneath the underpass. Had he been a bit too harsh on the teen? The hero suspected that might have been the case, though he couldn't recall any changes to the boy's mood. But the issue of accidentally revealing his casual form was too much of a pressing matter for him to idle. He supposed that a single broken dream was a fair price to pay to keep his secret under wraps. Still, as the wind tangled with his hair, the pro could feel a small drop of blood escape his mouth, even through the clenched smile. Damn, All Might cursed. I need to land now. The man rolled roughly onto an open roof of what he assumed to be a standard office building. The fencing surrounding the ledge wasn't too high or covering, but the building itself was tall enough that he was sure no one could see him. The smoke started plowing off his body not seconds later, all mixed with his sigh of relief. All Might hope that no one mistook the heavy exhaust for a fire and alerted the police. He really didn't want any more close calls today. As the last of the smoke rolled, the hero could feel his muscles relax. That's usually how he could tell he had reverted back to his debuffed form, besides the obvious smoke, of course. It surprisingly felt nice to release his hero form. He often compared it to holding in his gut at the pool. Sure, it looked good, but it was uncomfortable to hold for long periods of time. All Might slumped down against the railing, shoulders slouching as the man let himself go in the moment. His hand brushed against the side wound on its way to his forehead and stopped there instead. He clutched his shirt, feeling the fabric gather at his fist, and while pressing his knuckles against his star. The ugly wound haunted him every day, even when the hero didn't directly touch it. Every time he felt the smoke seep off of him or strained to hold his buff form, he had to resist the urge to curse out his greatest enemy for doing him dirty. He eventually let go of his shirt and brought his hand up to his forehead as he intended. His mind went wandering to the young student from under the bridge. The boy said he took out the villain on his own, despite his claim of not having a quirk, but the hero was just having a hard time believing it. The villain was definitely sneaky, and certainly a slippery foe to apprehend. He even gave the pro-hero himself a run for his money, considering his unstable hold of his hero form. So the man just couldn't fathom how a quirkless teen of such a small stature managed to subdue the sludge villain. It simply puzzled him. Maybe he took a look at the unconscious villain in the bottle for a better clue. He reached down for the bottles in his cargo pockets, only to find himself patting down empty fabrics. Confusion flashed onto All Might's face for a split second before utter panic took over. He stood up slowly, patting himself down, but only feeling the black pen in his pocket that he had signed the boy's notebook with. His head lurched on his neck, searching the roof around him for any sign of the bottles or the villain, but he found nothing. The bottles must have fallen out when he was worrying about holding his form while soaring over the public eye. Had he really been so preoccupied with keeping his secret that he had lost the villain in the process? How had he, All Might for goodness sake, made such a rookie mistake? The frail man hurried over the roof door and made his way down the staircase as fast as he could. And even if he did find the bottles, what if the villain had managed to escape? Who knows what damage the villain could cause after escaping his grasp, or how many innocent civilians would be put in danger because of him? He could feel his throat run dry at the thought, his eyes being completely overshadowed by his guilt. And yet, all his mind could do was leach back to the boy who had supposedly captured the villain alone. Regardless of it, he had actually done it or not, he told the boy that he couldn't become a hero. And All Might was not about to let a quirkless teenager show him up when it came to doing his job. Bakugo and the other two students that had stayed behind with him to talk with Deku now walked casually down an empty alleyway. The blonde could smell the others smoking behind him and clenched his fist angrily. Those extras were going to cost him his perfect record for UA. Didn't those dumbasses ever learn? Hey, Katsuki, one of the kids called to him from behind. Haven't you known Deku since you were kids? Yeah, the other chimed in, still with the cigarette in his mouth. Don't you think you might have gone a bit far today? Bakugo scoffed, kicking a soda bottle violently with his foot. He could hear the cap pop off as it hit the wall. It's his own fault for messing with me. He crushed his own soda can with a small explosion before chucking it into the trash. Seeing him so full of stupid dreams like when we were kids just pisses me off. He could hear his lackeys gasp in shock from behind him, but he could tell that they had both had their cigarettes still in their mouths. I thought I told you to stop smoking, the angry teen yelled, startling the two. He turned around to face them in his full rage. If you get caught, it'll be on my record, too. He could see their frightened faces of the extras that he enjoyed, but didn't really be exactly frightened of him. Or even pay attention to him, really, and that pissed him off. They both seemed to just be in shock, with their shaky fingers pointed at Bakugo. The one kid with a long finger quirk had his finger elongated and misshapen unconsciously, like he had no control over his power. Bakugo scowled. These losers were angry at him for claiming that he'd be the only kid from Aldera to get into UA, and yet they dared challenge him with such awful control over their quirks. These extras made his own quirk bubble with fury. Hey! The longer-fingered kid cried. Were those losers still gawking at him? They both took a step back in fear, and that was enough for Bakugo to realize that they weren't gaping at him. No, they were afraid of something behind him. The teen whipped his head around to look, but he wasn't fast enough. All he managed to catch was a wide, unhinged mouth lunging to swallow him whole. A body, with a good quirk, was all the boy heard before succumbing to pure, unfiltered adrenaline. The next time Bakugo could remember thinking clearly, all he could see was fire. The buildings around him were destroyed, and fire and rubble covered the alleyway. The teen could feel his quirk going haywire, lighting up his sludge-covered hands. To think that he was just harping on the rest of those idiots for their non-existent quirk control. He could hear someone screaming furiously amidst the raging flames and chaos. It took him a minute to figure out that the screaming was his own. He could barely breathe with the sludge wrapped around his face, the villain's giant set of teeth covering his own. The villain was trying to force its way down Bakugo's throat, and the kid was way too prideful to let that happen, even with a fight. Gah! He cried, fighting desperately against the muck. The blonde could feel the buckets of sweat pour down his face, figuring that the overload of perspiration must be causing his quirk to go nuts. As if I'd let this mudman take my body for himself. Despite the chaos, the villain was revealing the sheer power that this kid had. I mean, he was reveling in it. What strength! I've hit the jackpot. With this quirk and this much power, I can finally have my revenge on him. Bakugo felt the nasty set of large teeth curl into a hideous smile. What was this lunatic even thinking about? His eyes darted around the scene, but his vision too hazy for him to see much. Blackness dotted his sight near the corners, and he wasn't sure if it was from his panicked adrenaline or the strain he was undoubtedly putting on his worn body. He tried to focus on his surroundings, but the fire just engulfed everything. Buildings, signs, banners, everything was in flames. Was that because of his quirk? Did his explosive power really cause this massive destruction he was seeing? He tried to turn off his quirk, but endless sweat and anger just fueled the fire, literally. He felt awfully helpless in the moment as he struggled against the sludge, but the villain's cackling dampened out his fight. He jutted out his head as he felt more goo wrap around his face. His angry scowl still stuck upon his cheeks. His eyes bounced around again, trying to take a new angle of his surroundings. He saw something fuzzy lying on the broken pavement, but it wasn't sure it was actually something or just another blurry spot. But as his vision cleared, he gagged. Though it could have been due to the stuff down his throat, he would have thrown up if it weren't for the invasive sludge flooding his mouth. The blurry spot was a man, lying unconscious on the fiery pavement. His head was propped up by a broken piece of rubble, his mouth wide open and eyes clenched in pain. The blonde couldn't tell if the civilian was breathing, but he certainly wasn't moving. Oh, God, had his quirk done this? He couldn't live with himself if that man died because of him. Where were the heroes? Said heroes were scrambling to handle the situation. Mount Lady stood by the alley entrance, leaning over a crowd of civilians being blocked off by police. She reached out a single foot over the bystanders, holding on to some of the buildings for support, but the street was simply too narrow. There was no way that she would be able to fit between the buildings. She could hear the shutters of camera flashes from underneath her over the roaring flames and screams, and it was starting to annoy her. A single-lane street, my only weakness, she cried out. Someone else needs to handle this. Kamui Woods weaved through the debris and dodged pillars of fire that erupted from the broken concrete. He was considerably slowed down by the two squirming middle schoolers his branches had picked up, but that was his job. He dropped them off by the entrance where the police picked up and stopped to take a breather. He could see the fight with the sludge villain and the kid that he had trapped even from behind the crowd, but the heat had taken a toll on his quirk, and his branches were much thinner and more fragile than usual. If he even got near the center of the fight, he was sure he would be too useless to help. The civilian's dangerous explosion quirk was really causing problems. Explosive fires are my weakness, Kamui yelled over the chaos. Someone else has to take care of this one. The hero let out another sigh. The kid would just have to wait a bit longer until someone with a better quirk came to help. Backdraft could hear Kamui's cry, but the hero was currently fighting the raging fire that consumed the alleyway. The fighters hadn't arrived yet, so right now he was the only one keeping the flames from spreading uncontrollably. He knew how crucial his water hose quirk was to the situation, so he really couldn't just abandon his post. The heat from the fire was severely drying out though, and he was regretting his costume design in the moment. The many layers of thick fabric was not only making him hot, but weighing him down as well. Backdraft resisted the urge to jump away from the flames and rip off his helmet. He was starting to taste the thick smoke through his mouth guard and felt the sweat run down every inch of his skin. He wasn't sure how much longer he could last before he would have to leave for a safer spot, much less be of help to the sludge villain fight or the hostage situation. I've got my hands full. Where are the fighters? How's it looking over there? Death Arms grimaced, his sidekicks right beside him scouring for civilians. He had tried attacking the sludge villain, but his massive fist simply sank into the goo. He needed one of his sidekicks to help yank his arm out, but retreated after that failed attempt. He tried regrouping with the heroes present, but only Kamui Woods was really available, and even then Death Arms wasn't sure his quirk would be of any help. He's too slippery to get a hold of, and the hostage with the explosion quirk is resisting, the hero called back to Backdraft. It's like a minefield out here. We can't do anything against him. Suddenly, every hero was brought out of their thoughts by an anguished yell. Everyone, including the bystanders, turned to look at the blonde teen being held hostage by the sludge, but only Death Arms, Kamui Woods, and a few sidekicks could see the winced expression on the boy's face as he tried to fight back. One of his arms, which was covered in goo, was attempting to move closer to his face, but the sludge was pulling it in another direction. None of the heroes noticed the strain on that specific limb until the blonde's strength gave out and the slime came crashing towards the heroes. "Look out!" a sidekick yelled, and the heroes all jumped back to safety. Death Arms raised his hands to his face to block the debris that flew into the air at the strike. When the smoke cleared and the appendage moved, the group paled at the sight. A large crater now decorated the ground where the villain attacked. It had to be at least a foot deep and was charred black from the scorching of the civilian's explosion quirk. He noticed a few of his sidekicks shudder at the realization of what would be their condition if they had been hit. And honestly, the pro didn't blame them. The villain was plenty strong on his own, but with the teen's quirk practically at his disposal, it made the situation a lot more difficult. "It's no good. There's no one here who can stop him," Death Arms yelled, watching the sludge reform after the attack. "We have to wait for someone with the right quirk to show up." He gestured behind him for Kamui and his sidekicks to retreat. "Until then, keep the damage to a minimum," Backdraft replied, witnessing his glove melt due to the heat. "Someone will come eventually." "We just need that kid to hold on a bit longer," one of the sidekicks cried. Death Arms clenched his fist. "If only I had the strength to blow that villain away." All Might rushed over to the crowd, only to find his worst fears confirmed. The sludge villain that he once had in his pockets was now causing chaos in that alleyway, and holding a kid hostage as well. The seasoned pro wheezed as he wiped the sweat of his brow, his hair still tumbling around from his run today. He must have lost the bottles in his rush to get away from the underpass and dropped them as he was soaring. But how had the caps come off? He was sure that he had forced them on tight before he left. Had they simply popped off from the impact of the ground? Or was it something else? Regardless, the hero searched his body for any drop of stamina he could use to maybe transform, but found nothing. Had he seriously been this poor with his time management and already used up 3 hours? His scar throbbed in agony, and the man nearly doubled over. His hand shot from his forehead to clutch at it through his shirt. He looked out from behind the crowd. It was ironic. The #1 hero in all of the country forced to watch helplessly as a villain that he had just held in 2 soda bottles was holding a child hostage. It made him sick to think that the teen in the midst of all this mess would likely not come out alive if a hero didn't come soon. And still, his mind kept coming back to the green-haired boy whose dreams he had crushed. How much of a hypocrite would that boy think he was if he could see his hero now? Pathetic. He was really pathetic. Midoriya trudged down with his ruined notebook in his hands, his eyes just as empty as the street was, which was odd. The streets were normally packed at this time, but it wasn't like he was complaining. Gami was saying something, but the boy couldn't really make out what it was over his mind's own turmoil. "It's time to start thinking seriously about your futures." Midoriya was sure of his future up until today, and now he was really starting to doubt if he could ever do anything worthwhile in his life, despite being immortal. What would he even do if he wasn't going to be a hero? He hadn't really thought in that direction. Was he really that blinded by his dreams? What would his future even amount to? Would it even be worth anything to try? He still can't face reality. The teen was well aware of the twisted reality he lived in, where the powerful were praised and the weak dejected. Quirkless individuals were placed at the very bottom of the hierarchy, worse than even villains themselves. Gami would always coach him through these situations, telling him that he could always make a difference, that he could be a hero. He had the abilities, the skill, and the intelligence to be a far better hero than most students trying to be one. But society would never let him get that far. He was hoping that going to high school would leave him with a fresh start, but he wasn't really expecting much. Was it him that couldn't face reality or society itself? He didn't really know at this point. You need to be realistic. He was being realistic, right? He had abilities. Sure, they weren't quirk-related, but that shouldn't matter. He could do things that humans before couldn't. That had to be amounting to something. It was realistic that a kid with powers could be a hero. He could be just like any other kid that dreamed of being a hero. So why did those words sting so much? Was it because they were from All Might himself? Was it because that not even the #1 hero believed in him? The man had shut down so fast once the word quirkless was spoken. How realistic could he be if no one would give him a chance? Izuku! Ah! The boy yelled, startling out of his head as he dropped the notebook onto the pavement. He looked back at the spirit who was now silent. He leaned down to pick up the book, but something else fell instead. Then something else, then another thing. It took him a moment to figure out they were his own tears. He sniffled and rubbed at his nose, trying his best not to cry any more than he already had. Izuku. He felt so bad at the tears running down his cheeks. It had taken Gami so long to coax the boy out of the underpass, and even longer for the tears to stop. It was like all of the spirit's efforts from over the years were unraveling. He really didn't mean to disappoint his mentor, his friend, but that's all he's ever felt like he was doing. Midoriya didn't even realize he'd stopped walking or that Gami was now kneeling in front of him. The boy was now mumbling under his breath. Even the best of the best said it, he sobbed incoherently. This is my reality. No. Midoriya blinked in confusion. No? This is not your reality, Gami continued in the silence. This is their reality. Bakugo's reality, Aldera's reality, even All Might's reality. This is how they view the system, and they are trying to force it onto you. The teen couldn't deny that he found truth in the ghost's words, but his mind held on to the bad habit of spiraling deeper and deeper into his own darkness. It had been like this for years. Gami's support just barely lifted him out of the pit of despair that he fell into each day, but he couldn't go on like this forever. They do not like what you represent. What? What could a useless, quirkless kid like him ever represent? Failure? Worthlessness? Surely nothing good. You represent change, Izuku. You are a quirkless child attempting to be a pro-hero. Your existence alone is threatening everything that they stand for. Wow, he hadn't realized he'd been messing things up so much. You are change, and they are afraid of that. They want you to simply stay quiet and live how they believe you should. They want to discourage you from breaking the mold, simply because that's what they are used to. That is their reality, but it is most certainly not yours. They were afraid of him. That didn't seem right. After all, he was quirkless. What could he even do? You are your own person, Izuku, regardless of if you have a quirk or not. You cannot stop them from trying to force their beliefs onto you, but you do not have to listen. You are capable of doing anything you set your focus on, despite what they try to tell you. And if you want to be a hero, then you can. You are not bound by anyone's rules because you are not underneath anyone. That is your reality. His own person? What did that even mean? He'd been hearing the same things all his life, from his mother, his classmates, his hero, and now Gami was telling him that they didn't matter? He was so confused, and so used to being yanked around by everyone. He was supposed to be below the villains. That's just where he belonged. Enough. It felt like his head just exploded, like he'd been hit right to the temple with Kachan's quirk. He grabbed at his ears and wailed, dropping to the ground right next to his book. He could feel his mind trying to spiral down like he was used to, but the teen wouldn't let it this time. He was done listening to them, done needing their validation. Gami was right. He didn't need to be bound by anyone to feel accepted. He was done letting them break him. Did I say something wrong? Oh yeah, he still hadn't said a word in response. The spirit was probably a bit freaked out that he'd been crying again for the third time today. No, you probably said the most right thing I've ever heard. He watched the man tilt his head in confusion. Maybe he should elaborate some. I've been relying on others' opinions my whole life. I've been worrying about making my mother like me again, about proving to my classmates that they're wrong, even needing the validation of All Might simply to give me motivation to keep going. But I need to stop worrying about them. I need to live for myself. Gami nodded. I believe you are correct. I am sorry for making you believe that you needed to prove them wrong to be happy. No, Midoriya cried, before realizing his outburst and continuing. You don't need to be sorry. You've supported me for so long and helped me understand where I'm going wrong. If anything, I thank you for sticking with me all these years. The spirit didn't respond, but ruffled the boy's hair, his way of acknowledging that he was listening. He watched his successor pick himself up off the ground, both literally and figuratively, as well as his notebook. The teen brushed off his uniform and swung his bag over his shoulder before opening it up to put the book away. Now, with his hands free, he confidently held his backpack straps with a small smile. How about we go get some ice cream, Izuku? We always pass by that one stand on our way back home. Midoriya wiped his eyes before smiling again. That was the 5th time that Gami had called him by his actual name. The boy really wasn't used to it. Yeah, that sounds nice. Midoriya and Gami arrived at the ice cream stand, but to their dismay it was closed. Actually, closed was an understatement. The shop was practically boarded up and abandoned, like the owner just fled. That didn't make too much sense. The shop was open and running yesterday, and he didn't remember seeing any signs that said they'd be closed today. It was a pretty weird mystery, but not one Midoriya spent too much time contemplating. He had already cheered up on the way to the stand and didn't really need that sweet treat anymore. They had just begun walking around and away from it before the teen collapsed to the ground almost. This wasn't an unfamiliar situation, and it had actually nothing to do with his previous breakdown the boy had a few minutes ago. Gami immediately flung into action, slamming his hands down on the boy's shoulders and squeezing him tightly. Midoriya winced in discomfort, but acknowledged it as his anchor, his way to remind himself that the coming premonition was just that, completely separate from reality. His head spiraled, similarly to how it usually did when he lost control of his thoughts, but it wasn't exactly the same. Every time he had a premonition, he could hear a sort of buzzing in the back of his mind. Nothing too crazy, though. The teen watched as his view of the boarded-up ice cream store morphed into something else entirely. The first thing he noticed was a mass of light blonde hair. It wasn't anything that stood out, but he filed it away for further analysis. He was having a hard time clearly seeing the person in this premonition, almost like they were covered in something as they died. He wasn't sure it was water, as he had visions before of people drowning, and he could see them just fine. The second thing he picked out was the suffocating feeling of being, well, suffocated. It was so hard to breathe, like he had something stuck in his throat. Did this person choke to death? Midoriya wasn't sure, but it didn't feel like this person was choking on food or an object. It was a weird feeling, seemingly choking on air. But then the boy realized exactly what it was. The person was choking on sludge. It was the exact same feeling that he felt when the sludge was forced down his throat. Oh my God, did this person go through the same thing? He wouldn't wish this even on Bakugo, for God's sakes. The third thing he saw were the eyes of the individual. He was surprised that they were so clear compared to the rest of the person. They were open wide in fear, and Midoriya could see those bright red pupils shrink in contrast to the rest of his eyes. They seemed so familiar, those bright red eyes. Oh my God. Those were Kachan's eyes. The sludge villain was trying to take over Kachan's body, and he succeeded. Midoriya was yanked out of his head at that realization. Grounding his vulnerable consciousness to Gami's squeezing of his shoulders, the ice cream stand was now in front of him again, and the spirit was going through his normal process of calming the teen down after the foresight, but his mind was going a mile a minute. Oh my God, Kachan died, he stuttered out in disbelief, and it was by the same villain I just fought. The ghost froze. The villain escaped. All Might let the villain escape. The boy felt his phone go off in his back pocket, but was too stunned to even react. Gami shook him violently. Izuku! Izuku, that's a news update, the spirit exclaimed. Midoriya ignored the fact that Gami had referred to him by his real name again and whipped out his phone. The local news was blowing up over a villain attack. A few shopping districts down, an alleyway was on fire and looked like a war zone, but when the boy saw that familiar green sludge, he felt his heart stop. This wasn't possible. His foresights could never come true this soon. and yet he took off running towards the district. He hoped so badly that he could be wrong. He skipped to a stop at the first sight of the crowd. If an attack gained news traction, he was sure there would be a group of bystanders to follow. He pushed his way through, ignoring angry protests of the people that he had shoved a bit too hard. "Why are the heroes just standing there?" he heard a voice call out. "I heard the villain grabbed a middle schooler," someone else responded. Midoriya's quaking hands clamped over his mouth. No. It couldn't be true. It had to be someone else. He had his vision only a few minutes ago. This wasn't supposed to happen. "Hey, isn't that the villain All Might was chasing earlier?" another voice piped up. Then the crowd devolved into talking about All Might. Sure, the boy had left the pro with the villain arrested and restrained, but obviously the villain was free now, so where was All Might? "I can only do hero work for about 3 hours a day now." Oh no. Had All Might exhausted his time limit? Was that why he wasn't here yet? He finally reached the front of the crowd, and only a line of sparse policemen separated the civilians from the fight in front of him. There was fire practically everywhere, and rubble covered the pavement so thickly that he couldn't even see the sidewalk anymore. He could pick out pro-heroes, Death Arms, Kamui Woods standing next to the police. Why weren't they trying to fight the swirling slime that morphed and grew in the center of the alleyway? The slime had grown much larger and thicker than what had originally attacked the teen beneath the underpass. He could tell someone was struggling underneath all that goo, but couldn't see if it was Kachan or not. His mind flashed back to the feeling of when he was being suffocated by the slime. The feeling of being alone and helpless, as this villain tried to take over his body, practically invaded Midoriya as violently as the sludge had. He could see the explosions come from the sludge. He tried to convince himself that some other middle schooler could have had an explosion quirk as well. He could see the blonde hair peeking out from the sludge. He tried to convince himself that some other middle schooler also had an explosion quirk and blonde hair. He could see wide, red eyes turn to stare fearfully at the crowd from the sludge. Red eyes. Red eyes. Red eyes. Midoriya couldn't convince himself anymore. He raced out towards the villain, completely ignoring the cries of the police and the heroes from the sidelines. He didn't even notice All Might watch him in shock from the same crowd that he was just in, nor Gami's cry for him to wait as he passed through the crowd, literally. Death Arms and Kamui Woods gasped in complete horror, but they didn't say anything right away. A million things ran through Izuku's head. How could his premonition come true so soon? He would have to press Gami about it later. Where was All Might? The villain was supposed to be his responsibility, so where was the pro-hero? Weren't the other heroes doing anything? They were just standing there, doing absolutely nothing. They were just watching Kachan die. But the teen didn't focus on any of the spiraling thoughts going through his mind. He wouldn't freeze up now, especially when he was running towards the villain that had tried to steal his body earlier. "Get back here, you fool!" He could hear Death Arms howl, but paid no attention at all to the hero. "Stop!" Midoriya expertly dodged the debris all around the ground, but kept a steady pace towards the chaos. His eyes darted to each pile of rubble, looking for something to defend himself with, for when he got to the villain. He really didn't want to use his scythe, but if it came down to it, he would do anything to spare Kachan of the fate that he'd been forced to watch. The sludge turned in his direction, eyes bulging out when he realized who was running at him. "You!" the slime screamed. "I'll kill you!" Bakugo followed the villain's gaze, only to see a blurry figure with a mop of green hair running towards him. Is that Deku? But Midoriya ignored it all. His pressing thoughts, his screams of the useless heroes from behind him, even the threats of the villain in front of him. He passed a relatively large pile of debris and noticed something long and shiny sticking out. He stopped for the quickest moment to pull out the object, only to feel it break in two. Looking down at his hand for a slight second, he realized he had a piece of a sign pole, the broken edge sharp like a spear. This would have to work. Flinging his backpack onto the ground, the boy gasped, and he grabbed the makeshift spear in his right hand. He kept running at the villain. There were only a few more feet separating the two. "You're dead for what you did to me," the villain roared. Bakugo could only watch, a helpless victim in it all. Midoriya stepped down firmly on his left foot and raised his hand, holding the pole over his head. He only had one shot. This had to be perfect. He didn't focus on any of the distractions, not the raging of the villain or the cries of the heroes or the roars of the flames. He cleared his mind of everything except for one thing, a single thought that echoed over and over and over in his head. "I will save people." The pole flew out of his hand with a speed that could rival Ingenium. It sailed into the air and everyone watched with stunned breaths. Even the villain himself watched right as it sank into the eye that the boy had decayed earlier. The scream that left those enormous set of teeth stained the ears of everyone who watched. The green-haired teen didn't stop, though. The attack had given him his only opportunity to save Bakugo. He sidestepped and met the blonde's terrified eyes with his own. The sludge had recoiled just enough to reveal the teen's hands, and Midoriya didn't think twice before grabbing it with both of his. With all of his strength, he tugged as hard as he could. He was afraid that his strength alone wouldn't be enough to free his bully from the goo. He was afraid that he would end up needing Gami's help, and that the man wouldn't be able to reach him in time. But his fears were quelled as Bakugo came flying out of the slime. The two boys tumbled down onto the rough pavement, but Midoriya didn't waste a second. He got up on his feet and yanked Bakugo up with him. He shoved the blonde back as a large hand of slime plowed towards him, but he wasn't going to let himself get caught again. The boy jumped back as the limb crashed down, debris flying everywhere. He picked up one of the smaller pieces of concrete that had been sent airborne and chucked it right at the villain's mouth. Nailed him right in the teeth. "Stop getting in my way," the villain cried, unhinged his jaw, ready to swallow the teen whole. The hero standing on the sideline suddenly dashed towards the two boys. "Does he have a death wish or something?" Death Arms bellowed. Midoriya almost laughed at that, but managed to dodge the first chomp the villain had made at him. Bakugo could only watch in shock from the ground, still trying to catch his breath. In the crowd's panic, All Might still watched from the back of in his debuffed form. He was pathetic. He really was pathetic. The boy whose dream he crushed, who had been on his mind all day, was now risking his life to save the hostage, and he, the #1 hero, could only watch. The sight alone filled him with the urge to step in, but it wasn't until the feeling of uselessness set in that he really got the power to fight. The green-haired teen was worried. He couldn't dodge forever, but the only way to switch up to the offensive would be to reveal his scythe, and he really didn't want to do that. Not only would he get in big trouble with the law for using his quirk illegally, but the boy could only imagine how Katon would react. Suddenly, a large hand grabbed his arm and pulled Midoriya away from the fight. He could only see the two signature tufts of blonde hair, but that was all the teen needed to recognize who it was. "The lesson I left you with," All Might spoke loudly over the chaos. "I should practice what I preach." The hero lifted his right fist back behind him as the crowd went wild at his side. "A pro should always be ready to risk his life." Blood spewed from his smile, though no one could tell amidst all of the other things happening at the same time. "Detroit Smash!" The pure force coming off of the punch sent a shockwave in every direction. The other heroes just barely managed to stay anchored to the ground. The bystanders simply stood in shock, just as if time itself had stopped. A single drop of rain nailed Midoriya in the head, and he lifted his head up to the clouds. Then another, and another, and another. Everyone, even the heroes, looked around in confusion as the rain started to pour down from the heavens. "No way," the boy mumbled. "He changed the air pressure with that punch?" As the rain came down harder, it quenched out the fire that Backdraft had been battling vigorously. Cheers came from the civilians and reporters watching. All Might had beaten the villain and changed the weather with a single punch. The fight was finally over, and Katon was alive. All Might had left the scene just as quickly as he arrived, leaving the rest of the heroes to pick up the villain's scattered body. Midoriya and Bakugo sat by the entrance to the alleyway, a team of paramedics scrambling to check them for injuries. Thankfully, none had anything more than some minor scratches, but the medics made a thorough search just in case. The news reporters had been roped off away from the middle schoolers, so they couldn't get any statements from the two boys, but they kept their cameras rolling on the kids. "What were you thinking?" Death Arms lectured, but Midoriya didn't bother to pay much attention. The heroes had berated him nonstop since All Might left, and the teen could partially understand why. He had run right into a villain fight, of course. The pros thought it was foolish. They obviously didn't know that he was immortal, but that was a given. They thought that he was just a normal civilian child who had almost gotten himself killed. He didn't have to turn around to realize that Gami was now standing behind him. The spirit had a sort of air around him that gave his presence away to the boy. It made the teen realize and that he was safe. He felt much calmer, knowing that his friend was right behind him. He had lost focus of the man's whereabouts in all of the chaos. But even still, he had managed to save the blonde, subduing the villain long enough to pull him out of the sludge. But none of the heroes even commented on that, much less praised him. He wasn't asking to be praised, but all the heroes seemed to remember him doing was run idiotically into the fight and nothing else. Bakugo, on the other hand, got plenty of praise. They admired him for his powerful quirk and simply fueled his ego. Not a single hero commented on how his so-called powerful quirk had restricted them from actually helping him or stopping the villain, or that his quirk had caused the majority of the damage to the district in the first place, too. Midoriya paled when he realized that Gami had been right all along. Society was definitely a hierarchy. Bakugo was at the top, and he was at the bottom. At one point, Midoriya phased back into reality long enough to realize that Bakugo was yelling at him. "You stupid, quirkless Deku!" No, not that infectious word. "What? You're quirkless?" the heroes practically yelled. Luckily, the boy didn't think the reporters had caught the comments. They had started lecturing him again, turning him away from praising the blonde. "How could you even think about running in like that when you can't do anything?" one of the heroes yelled. Midoriya wasn't sure which one it was, but he wasn't about to let them berate him for being quirkless. He had already heard enough before the toxic word entered the fray. He wasn't just going to sit and take it like he would have in the past. The teen stood up, startling the heroes and the cameras on him. The heroes tried to get him to sit back down so they could continue yelling at him, but the boy wouldn't let them. He fought the urge to call the heroes out on their bullshit right then and there, not caring if the cameras caught his words. But Midoriya had enough for the day. And honestly, the boy was pretty much done with the world at that moment. So he turned to exit the alleyway in silence, ignoring the words from behind him. Then, Death Arms grabbed him by his right shoulder. Gami could feel the air temperature drop by 10 degrees. "Don't you dare touch me," the green-haired teen growled, and ripped off the hero's hand. He was so close to going off on the man, but considering that the reporters might have caught his first comment already, he reluctantly bit his tongue. He left the scene without saying as much as anything else, despite the other heroes still trying to make him stay. Bakugo could only watch in shock. Did Deku just growl at a hero of all people? What the actual fuck was going on? Midoriya escaped the wave of reporters that tried to corner him after he had left with much difficulty. He shuffled home on an empty suburban street, his mood a complete hurricane. He wasn't sure what to think, honestly. Gami's voice broke the silence. "I am really proud of you, Izu. What you did today, while it did terrify me, was very brave." He looked up at the spirit, unsure of how to react. "You think so? You saved the life of your bully, and did it quite well, if I must say." Most wouldn't understand why the boy had chosen to save his childhood bully, but to Midoriya it made perfect sense. "I just did what any real hero would do." He put a bit more emphasis on the word real. Gami seemed to understand exactly what he was trying to say. Both were pretty angry at the heroes on the scene. They simply stood on the sidelines and watched as Bakugo struggled for his life, each and every one of them. They apparently felt as if they didn't have the right quirks for the job, so instead of trying to improvise, trying to do something, they just stood there, ready to sacrifice the life of a child because Plan A didn't work out. And there was no argument that could ever convince the green-haired boy that Bakugo would have survived without intervention. No argument could persuade him that a hero would have arrived if he had simply waited. After all, he had watched the blonde suffocate to death just minutes before in his own mind. Speaking of that, Midoriya did ask the spirit what was up with his premonition today, but not even he could explain it. Gami had insisted that he had never had a vision come to pass until at least an hour after viewing it, so the premonition even surprised him. The best the ghost could do was suggest that maybe the foresight was supposed to happen earlier, but got pushed back due to his emotional breakdown. The explanation was shaky at best, but it was also the best either of them had. The teen hoped that, for someone else's sake, this premonition incident never happened again. "Hey, Deku!" Bakugo yelled, running down the street and startling the boy out of his thoughts. He really didn't want to deal with the blonde right now. He turned to face his bully, and looked like he was shaking with rage, his fist clenched at his side. "I never asked you to save me," he called out with a scowl on his face. "I could have beaten him myself." The angry teen's eye twitched. Midoriya made no effort to reply, letting the blonde continue as he indubitably would. "How dare a quirkless failure like you pity me? Trying to win me over? Don't you dare mock me." After that, Bakugo spun around and stormed off while grumbling under his breath. Neither Gami nor Midoriya made a move to stop him. Whispers in the back of the teen's mind kept insisting that he was right, that he should focus on a more realistic future. But the boy was done listening to that part of his conscience. Today was a turning point for him. He didn't need Bakugo to accept him of his dream. He never did. It felt good to finally realize that. But just when he thought the day was done giving him surprises, it threw one last curveball at him. "I am here!" Midoriya flinched at the voice, and the spirit whipped around protectively. But the boy dismissed him. Gami relaxed but stayed on guard as the pro-hero flew out one of the alleyways. All Might, why are you here? He wondered. Wouldn't you have been surrounded by reporters? They were everywhere. The hero struck a comical pose. Shaking them off is nothing to me. After all, I'm All Might. The man couldn't even keep up his form to finish his sentence, and he slumped over, losing his muscles instantly. Blood spewed from his mouth. The teen looked around in confusion, unsure of what to make of the man's other form. What just happened? All Might nearly slapped himself. That's right, he'd forgotten that this child didn't know about his true form. Remember how I said I could only work 3 hours a day? Yeah, but, well, this is how I look the other 21 hours. The boy just blinked. I guess this explained how the man wasn't caught in public more often. Look, kid, he tried to get back on track. I've come to thank you and revise what I said earlier. I also have a proposal. Midoriya just blinked again. His tired brain was struggling to take it all in. Without watching you in action, I would have been just another helpless bystander in that mess, so thank you. The teen took a second to process what the hero just told him. Helpless bystander? Did that mean that All Might was in the crowd? That the hero watched too as Bakugo was dying? Of all the people at the scene, it was only you, timid and quirkless you, who acted. You spurred me into action. There it was again. That awful, toxic word that society had stained him with. Why did it keep coming back? Most of the top heroes show greatness even as children. Many claim that their bodies moved before they could think. The boy could hear how hyped the man was getting, and it just made him more and more uncomfortable. Gami was definitely feeling the same thing, but neither of them moved. They really hadn't learned their lesson from beneath their underpass. That's what happened to you back there, yes? Not really. What spurred the child into action wasn't some unknown force that simply pushed him along. No, not at all. What made him act was knowing that Bakugo would die if he didn't intervene. That Bakugo would die a painful, agonizing death by a villain who would have stayed successfully detained if it wasn't for All Might. That Bakugo would die at the hands of such a monster, while no one did anything to try and save him. Bakugo would have died. All Might mistook the boy's silence as confirmation. Well, I'm here to tell you that with my power, you can be a hero. Midoriya didn't make a single sound or move a single muscle. What? What did this man think he was saying? Could he even hear the words coming out of his own mouth? I know, the teen finally replied. The seasoned hero did a double take. What? I already realized I can be a hero, Midoriya continued, and I don't need anyone else's approval. Gami was about to jump the man for a second time, but decided that he should let his successor finish first. He was glad his friend finally decided to grow a backbone, plus it was pretty entertaining to watch. But without my power, without a quirk. Are you serious? He cried. I really thought you were here to apologize, but you've only made it worse. Kid, listen. Are you even listening to yourself? Midoriya almost slumped down at that point, but used all his willpower to remain standing. Did you come here to tell me I can only be a hero with your power? There just isn't any other way you... Didn't anybody actually see me fight the villain? I subdued the villain long enough to rescue Kacchan, and kept him and myself from getting hit by any of the attacks. The boy could feel the steam pouring out of his ears. That was more than any of those other heroes did, and I didn't need any quirk during any of it. With every word, the boy lost his will to fight. He knew he didn't need the validation of anyone to be a hero, but it hurt him to have to deal with his former idol like this. I just can't believe this. Midoriya couldn't bear to look at the man in his eyes anymore. If you really were in that crowd, then you should have at least seen firsthand what I can do. I bet you don't even believe that I took out the sludge villain on my own in the underpass. All Might didn't answer, but he didn't have to for his thoughts to come clearly enough. Look, I'm just going to go home, he said dejectedly. I won't tell anyone about the nature of your quirk, since you've made it obvious that it can be passed down or something. The green-haired child turned around but lifted his head up high. He was ready to leave and end this awful day. So was Gami. Look, kid, I think you should reconsider. All Might was scaredly like Kacchan. They both just didn't know when to quit. You're not going to be able to get anywhere when your records say quirkless. You'll just be spinning in circles until you've lost all energy to keep going. I can see your potential, and that's why I'm offering you my quirk. Hell, the fact that it's my quirk should have you excited. Midoriya's head whipped towards the frail man so fast he was afraid it'd snap his neck off. How dare you? You can't see any of my potential if you're so stuck on the fact that I don't have a quirk. You can keep your crappy quirk for all I care, even if it guarantees me a spot at UA's hero course. The teen was so angry, he didn't even have to fight back any tears. How could the number one hero, the man who inspired so many people in and even out of the country, have such flawed logic? He was ready to leave, and then the man just pulled him back with something even more stupid. It baffled him, but he was so furious in the moment, too furious to even contemplate it. I'd rather rely on my own skill and fail, he ranted, than need a pity handout to succeed, because even if I fail, I'll just get back up and try again. No one will be able to keep me down, not UA, not the Hero Association, not even society itself, and that's exactly how I'll become a hero. He turned his head back forward, and unfortunately missed the number one hero gape like a fish out of water. Gami didn't, though, and he reveled in the sight. I could go on and on about how utterly wrong you are, how utterly wrong you're going to be. He clutched one of his backpack straps tightly in one hand, shaking with rage so badly he knew All Might could see it. But I don't have to. He took a confident step forward, away from the pro and towards his house. He still didn't face the man, not wanting to lose his morale at realizing he was practically back-talking the number one hero in the country. He still heard no word from All Might, not that he wanted to. The man had disappointed him enough, and each comment that escaped his mouth only fueled the boy's fury. Not even Gami broke the silence, eager to see where his successor was going with this. The silence simply infected the air, so thick that he could cut it cleanly with his scythe. And then Midoriya walked away. He turned down a deal that, in another universe, would bring him to UA with a completely different mindset. Somewhere else he had accepted his idol's offer and received a quirk that could only be described in legends. But this wasn't that universe, and Midoriya wouldn't take the infamous one for all. He would simply walk away, but not without finishing his comment, a statement that would plague the pro-hero's mind far longer than the boy did earlier in the day. A declaration that would become the backbone for everything the teen stood for and the change he represented. Just watch me. This concludes Chapter 7 of Deku and Death. I'll pick up with Chapter 8 here as soon as possible, and as always, thank you guys so much for listening.